Two friends celebrating New Year's Eve at a waterfront party accepted a stranger's invitation to continue the celebration on his yacht at 4 in the morning. By dawn on January 1st, 1998, they had vanished without a trace, sparking New Zealand's most controversial murder investigation and a conviction that divides the nation 27 years later. The Marlborough Sounds sit at the northeastern tip of New Zealand's South Island, a maze of sunken valleys and forested peninsulas where the ocean has carved deep inlets into ancient mountains. In summer, the Sounds transform into a water playground. Boats cluster in sheltered bays. Dolphins surface between the channels. The water reflects the sky in shades of blue that photographs never quite capture. On New Year's Eve 1997, Furneaux Lodge in Endeavour Inlet became the destination for somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 young people, ready to celebrate the arrival of 1998. The lodge sits accessible only by boat, isolated and beautiful, the kind of place where the music carries across the water and the party extends from the lodge itself down to the docks, where yachts and launches bob in the gentle swell. It should have been just another New Year's celebration, the kind people remember fondly years later. Instead, it became the setting for a mystery that would haunt New Zealand for decades. Ben Smart was 21 years old in December 1997, working as a sound engineer and living life with the easy confidence of someone who made friends everywhere he went. His parents would later describe him as thoughtful, responsible, the kind of young man who called home regularly and actually seemed to enjoy family gatherings. He had a good job, good friends, and the kind of steady presence that made him someone people turned to when things got complicated. Olivia Hope was 17, just finishing school and looking toward her future with the optimism unique to 17-year-olds who haven't yet learned that plans can shatter. She was smart, popular, close with her family. Her father, Gerald, was protective but trying to give her space to become independent. Letting her go to the New Year's party at Furneaux Lodge was part of that. A big event, yes, but she'd be with friends. And it wasn't like she was going alone into the unknown. Ben and Olivia knew each other, ran in overlapping social circles, but they weren't particularly close. On New Year's Eve, they ended up at the same party through separate routes. Olivia had traveled to the lodge with a group on a chartered yacht called Tamarack. Ben had arrived separately. The party was massive by New Zealand standards, transforming the typically quiet lodge into something approaching a music festival. Boats packed the inlet. Music competed with laughter and conversation. The bar did steady business. It was hot, crowded, exactly what you'd expect from a New Year's celebration drawing young people from across the region. As midnight approached and then passed, the party showed no signs of winding down. This was 1998 arriving, after all, with 1999 and the millennium itself waiting just around the corner. People were in the mood to celebrate everything. Sometime in the early morning hours of January 1st, the situation on the Tamarack became complicated. The yacht was packed with people, many drinking heavily, and apparently there was discussion about who would sleep where and whether there was enough room for everyone who needed a place to crash. At some point, Ben and Olivia, along with others, were looking for alternative accommodations for what remained of the night. This is where the story fragments into competing versions, but here's what appears consistent. A man approached Ben and Olivia, and possibly others in their group, offering them a place to sleep on his yacht. Different witnesses would later describe this man differently. Some said he had stubble on his face, possibly tattoos, was wearing a Levi shirt and jeans. Others remembered different details, but the core fact remained. Someone offered, and Ben and Olivia accepted. Around 4 in the morning, water taxi driver Guy Wallace ferried a small group from the lodge area out to various boats. On one of these trips, he took Ben and Olivia to a yacht. Wallace would later describe the man who met them as scruffy, with 2 days' growth of beard, possibly 5'9", wiry build. Wallace remembered this trip because it was one of his last before he finished his shift, and because he recognized both Ben and Olivia from earlier in the evening. That water taxi ride was the last confirmed sighting of Ben Smart and Olivia Hope alive. They stepped onto a yacht in the pre-dawn darkness of January 1st, and they disappeared. When the Tamarack and other boats began departing Furneaux Lodge later that morning, Ben and Olivia weren't among the passengers heading home. Their families expected them back. When they didn't arrive, concern quickly escalated to alarm. On January 3rd, their families reported them missing. By then, most of the boats that had been at Furneaux Lodge had scattered across the Sounds and beyond. The massive police investigation was about to begin. Detective Sergeant John Galbraith of the New Zealand Police took charge of what would become one of the largest missing persons investigations in the country's history. The challenge was immediately apparent. Between 1,500 and 2,000 people had been at that party. Boats had come and gone throughout the night and morning. The Marlborough Sounds cover hundreds of square kilometers of coastline and water. And they were looking for 2 people who had last been seen getting into an unidentified yacht somewhere in that vast, beautiful, unforgiving landscape. The investigation began with what investigators call victimology, understanding who Ben and Olivia were, their habits, their relationships, any reason they might have had to deliberately disappear. That line of inquiry led nowhere. Neither had any reason to vanish. They had loving families, good futures ahead, no significant problems that might drive them to run away. The theory that they'd deliberately disappeared was quickly abandoned. This left foul play as the most likely explanation, which meant finding that yacht and the man who'd offered them a place to sleep. The police began the painstaking process of identifying and interviewing everyone who'd been at Furneaux Lodge that night. Witness statements poured in. People remembered seeing Ben and Olivia. Some remembered the man who'd approached them, but the descriptions varied. Different heights, different features, different clothing. Memory, especially after a night of drinking and celebrating, is unreliable even with the best intentions. Guy Wallace, the water taxi driver, became a crucial witness. He'd actually ferried Ben and Olivia to the yacht. He'd seen the man who met them. He could describe the boat. Investigators worked with Wallace to create a description of both the man and the yacht. The man, 2 days of stubble, possibly tattoos on his arms, 5'9", wiry build, scruffy appearance, wearing a Levi shirt and jeans. The yacht. Wallace remembered details about its appearance, though later there would be disputes about exactly what those details were. The search of the Sounds was extensive. Police boats, volunteer boats, aerial searches. Divers went into the deeper channels. The search covered weeks, then months. They found nothing. No bodies. No yacht matching Wallace's description perfectly. No clear evidence of what had happened after Ben and Olivia stepped onto that boat. 5 months into the investigation, police arrested a man named Scott Watson. He was a 30-year-old from Picton who'd been at Furneaux Lodge that New Year's Eve on his yacht, a sloop he'd built himself. Watson had a criminal record, mostly for burglary and drugs, nothing violent, but investigators had become increasingly focused on him as a suspect. The problem was that Wallace, when initially shown photo montages that included Watson's picture, hadn't identified him as the man from the water taxi. Watson's boat didn't match the description Wallace had given, and there was no physical evidence linking Watson to Ben or Olivia. But then came what prosecutors would call the breakthrough. Investigators showed Wallace a different photo montage, this one created differently. This time, Wallace identified Watson. The identification came after Wallace had been interviewed multiple times. after he'd been shown Watson's photo before, after months of intense media coverage about the case. Wallace would later say he felt tremendous pressure during the investigation, that detectives had even suggested he might somehow be responsible for the disappearance. He said he felt he had to give them something. The second key piece of evidence came from forensic examination of Watson's yacht. Among 390 human hairs recovered from a blanket on the boat, forensic scientists identified 2 hairs through mitochondrial DNA testing. They said one hair matched Olivia Hope's mitochondrial DNA profile. The problem with mitochondrial DNA is that it's not as specific as nuclear DNA. The profile that matched Olivia also matches roughly 1 in 200 people of European descent, and the chain of custody for the hair evidence would later be questioned. Watson's lawyers argued the samples could have been contaminated, pointing to a 1-centimeter hole in the evidence bag containing Olivia's known hair sample. Despite these evidentiary challenges, prosecutors moved forward. The case they built was largely circumstantial. Watson had been at the party. His boat had been in the area. He'd left Furneaux Lodge shortly after the time Ben and Olivia disappeared. Wallace had identified him, eventually, as the man on the boat. The hair evidence suggested Olivia had been on his yacht. Watson's behavior after the disappearance, including some statements to other people, was presented as suspicious. The trial of Scott Watson began in February 1999 and lasted 11 weeks. It became a media sensation. New Zealand is a small country where everyone knows someone who knows someone, and this case had gripped the nation. The prosecution's case rested on several pillars. First, Wallace's identification of Watson from the photo montage. Second, the hair evidence. Third, Watson's opportunity. He'd been there. His boat had left around the right time. Fourth, character evidence suggesting Watson was capable of violence. Fifth, the absence of any other credible suspect. The defense attacked each element. They brought experts who questioned the hair evidence, arguing contamination was possible and the statistical match wasn't strong enough for certainty. They challenged the photo montage procedure, suggesting it was suggestive rather than neutral. They presented Watson's alibi. He said he'd left alone, that he'd never met Ben or Olivia, that he'd been back at his home mooring by early morning. They pointed out that Wallace's initial description of the boat didn't match Watson's yacht, and that Wallace had failed to identify Watson in the first photo montages. One of the most compelling defense arguments involved a couple known as Witnesses A and B. These witnesses came forward after Watson's arrest and described seeing a man and woman matching Ben and Olivia's descriptions on a different yacht altogether, a ketch with distinctive features, including a portholes configuration that didn't match Watson's boat. The man on this yacht was described as having stubble and wearing clothing similar to what Wallace had described. Author John Golter later called this testimony a bombshell. It suggested Ben and Olivia had been on a completely different boat, that police had arrested the wrong man. The prosecution argued that witnesses A and B were mistaken, that they'd seen different people or mixed up their timeline. The jury, after deliberating, sided with the prosecution. On September 8, 1999, Scott Watson was found guilty of both murders. As the verdict was read, Watson turned to the jury and said, "You're wrong." He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 17 years. His appeals were denied. But the controversy was just beginning. In the years following the trial, doubts began to multiply. Guy Wallace, the water taxi driver whose identification had been so crucial, made a remarkable statement. He said police had misled him over the photo identification. He became convinced Watson was innocent and that he, Wallace, had inadvertently contributed to imprisoning an innocent man. He maintained this position in multiple interviews and signed an affidavit to this effect. Wallace died in March 2021, still insisting Watson was not the man he'd seen that night, Rosalind McNeely, the bar manager at Furneaux Lodge, who had also identified Watson from a photo montage, later recanted as well. When she saw a photograph of Watson from that New Year's Eve showing him clean-shaven, contradicting the stubbled description, she signed an affidavit saying she'd made a mistake. Even more striking, Olivia's father, Gerald Hope, began expressing concerns. He met with Watson in prison, with journalist Mike White present. Hope told Watson he'd felt uncomfortable about the way the prosecution had run the case. The Crown's questioning of Olivia's sister Amelia at trial particularly disturbed him. They'd questioned her about friendship rings until she broke down in tears, which Hope felt was pure theater designed to emotionally manipulate the jury. The case became a cause célèbre for those who study wrongful convictions. Multiple books were written questioning the verdict. Documentaries examined the evidence, legal experts pointed to the lack of bodies, the questionable identification procedures, the hair evidence that was far from conclusive, the alternative yacht sighting that was never properly investigated. In June 2024, the Court of Appeal heard new arguments about the case, examining the hair evidence and the photo montage procedures. In September 2025, they released their decision. After careful consideration of all the additional evidence and arguments about potential wrongful conviction, the court declined to overturn Watson's conviction. The appeals court found that while there were legitimate concerns about some investigation procedures, taken as a whole, the evidence still supported the jury's original verdict. Watson remains in prison, still maintaining his innocence, still saying the jury got it wrong on that day in September 1999. Ben Smart and Olivia Hope's bodies have never been found. Their families have no graves to visit, no place where they can feel close to the children they lost. The Marlborough Sounds, so beautiful in summer sunshine, hold whatever happened to them in depths that gave up no secrets. Scott Watson has served more than 25 years in prison for their murders. The conviction stands, affirmed multiple times by New Zealand's highest courts, but the doubt persists, serious enough that even the victim's father questions whether justice was truly served. This case changed how New Zealand approaches major investigations. The photo montage procedures used in Watson's identification led to reforms in how police present suspects to witnesses. The hair evidence controversy prompted new protocols for evidence handling and DNA analysis. The media coverage led to discussions about how high-profile cases can be tried fairly when an entire nation is watching and forming opinions. But for Ben Smart's and Olivia Hope's families, none of that brings them back. Olivia's 21st birthday came and went without her. Ben's parents grew older without their son. The New Year's celebration that should have been just another party became the last night of two young lives. So here's what I'm curious about. When the evidence is circumstantial, when key witnesses recant, when even the victim's father expresses doubt, but the courts repeatedly uphold the conviction, what does justice actually look like? Is it possible the system got it right despite all the doubts? Or are we watching a wrongful conviction unfold in slow motion? I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. This is part of the Deadly New Beginnings series, where we're exploring cases where New Year's celebrations turned fatal. If you want more international cases like this, where the investigation itself becomes part of the story, subscribe. New episodes drop 3 times a week. This has been Umbra Cases.